Don't miss out. Get your free copy of Dr. Guido Holzmann's How Inflation Destroys Civilization. Visit Mises.org/Rothpod free to get the book.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, executive editor with the Mises Institute. And here with me, thankfully, and of course, is Tho Bishop, my co-host. And we're here together today at the Austrian Economics Research Conference here in Auburn. And we're doing a series of episodes, so you're probably hearing this a little after the fact. But we also have now with us right now, Łukasz Dominiak. And Łukasz is from Poland. He's one of our fellows. He is a professor at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Poland, and we want to talk to him a little bit about Polish liberalism. Now, if you follow me at all, you know that when I use the term liberalism, I'm using it in the historical sense, like classical liberalism, radical liberals, like we're talking like Richard Cobden, we're talking Gustav de Molinari, that sort of tradition, Frederick Bastiat, Thomas Jefferson. So we're going to talk about that and that tradition as it exists in Poland. And this is going to be a pretty basic level for that we're going to cover, because if you've been studying Poland, this is all going to be review. But if you're a normal person, normal American, and you have not been studying Poland at all, we're hoping to introduce you to some great information about the liberal tradition in Poland as it has existed really for hundreds of years. And I want to get just a little bit into that, and then we'll go into the state of current radical liberalism in Poland as well. And Łukasz can give us a lot of details about that. But to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of Poland as part of the Western tradition. And if you follow the works of historian Ralph Raico, he makes a comment in a series of lectures for the Mises Institute on the history of liberty, and he talks about how this Western tradition expands part of the globe, but that part of the globe, he says, basically extends from North America to Warsaw. And so he's making this claim that there's this part of the world that is really the cradle of Western civilization, and it's European civilization that has this outpost in North America and Australia, Canada, that sort of thing. Of course, the United States. But when he says, when he mentions how far east it extends, he stops with Poland, interestingly. And he does include Poland very much and mentions it more than once as really a part of the West, as part of this tradition that we think of as the West, as integral to these institutions that have led to modern ideas of liberty, decentralization, natural rights, those sorts of things. And we can see other ways that Poland is Western, right? And they use Latin, for example, and Roman Catholicism is a central religion there, which points the whole situation west. So you can see why Ralph comes to this conclusion. So perhaps you can expand a little bit on that, and we can just really start just talking here about Poland's role in Europe, in the West, and in this history of liberalism. And so do you agree then with Ralph's assessment of where Poland sits in this idea of Western civilization?
Well, I would agree with, for sure, with part of the statement that Poland sits in the Western tradition. I don't know whether I would agree entirely with the latter part of the statement that the Western tradition ends with, well, for sure not with Warsaw, but ends, let's say, with Polish border. Because this is not black and white, of course, right? That's a very complex question, very complex phenomenon. But there is something to it. Yeah, I would say that everything sort of starts with the way Polish state and country begins its existence, which was in the 10th century. And again, I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have very basic sort of, run through the Polish history. Remember that the history of Poland is more than 1,000 years. So that's pretty long time, and people were quite busy during this time. So yeah, you can imagine there's a lot. But the very beginning, I mean, is important, right? So we had the baptism of Poland in 966 by our first prince, Mieszko I. And he decided, as you remember, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, from the collapse sort of develops Western Europe. And at the same time, we of course have Eastern Roman Empire, and how the Christianity penetrated medieval Europe was that it was more or less from this, very beginning, from the division between Western and Eastern Roman Empire, also divided into Eastern Church and Western Church. Of course, it was finally completed with this schisma in 1054, finally, the Great Schisma. But the division was sort of from the very beginning, let's say, more or less. And so the crucial question, I think, for Poland, when Mieszko I was making a decision whether to get Christianity for Poland as a country, was where to get it from. To get it from the Western Church or to get it from the Eastern Church. And by making a decision to get it from the Western Church, I think he made this seminal decision for our nation, for our people, to become the part of the Western tradition. And why is that? It's not only because of Christianity, because Christianity we also have in the East, right? So like Russia, like other countries in the East, they also share this part. But what they don't share is what was coming with Western Christianity, with Catholicism, basically. So that was Roman Christianity, Roman Catholicism, that was Latin tradition, pretty much penetrated by this very fact. So even without adopting directly any legal institutions from the, let's say, Roman tradition of Roman law, the very fact of adopting Catholic Western religion, Christianity, it was in a package with canon law, and canon law was pretty much influenced by the Roman law, by the Roman institutions. Catholic religion is also under pretty strong influence, and of course that was changing over the years, but still, one way or the other, be it a Platonism or Aristotelianism, by the Greek philosophy. So we also have immediately somehow enshrined in the religious institutions that were adopted in the 10th century by Mieszko I, this Greek philosophy somehow penetrating slowly but steadily. And so that's finally, of course, I think you're aware we have Latin alphabet. That also comes with that, which is different than a Cyrillic alphabet in the East. That might also be the reason for which people like Reiko might be willing to classify Poland as the sort of last bulwark of Western civilization, let's say, in this part of Europe. But for sure, that makes a point that Poland is standing pretty firmly within this tradition. So I think that the first decision of this baptism in the 10th century sort of paved the way, the path for Poland becoming Western tradition. And remember, that was the 10th century, pretty early, pretty much five centuries after the collapse of Western Roman Empire. So the very beginning of the medieval Europe.
So if we fast forward then a ways, I mean, we only have so much time, although I could listen to you go on this topic for a long time. Let's talk about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth a little bit.
That's quite a jump.
This is true.
Yeah, but that's a very good point.
But it brings us up closer to the modern time. Also, this is one of the largest polities in Europe in its time, which most Americans don't know about. And incorporated, as the name implies, parts of Lithuania, but also parts of what's now Ukraine, and just a large state. And when I was in graduate school, I took a history of Eastern Europe class, and for whatever reason, I ended up making my big project on Poland. And I was just really fascinated with this whole history that very few people, even within libertarian circles, have ever written on. This whole thing about golden liberty, as it's usually translated into English, with this elected monarch, with this legislature that had all of these vetoes on the executive power. There was a high degree of decentralization. Now it wasn't all plus. I mean, there were some drawbacks to that system. But nevertheless, it was quite remarkable if you're looking at that versus some of the despotisms and absolutism that were coming into fashion in the West in that time, especially in France. This was quite a contrast. So what can you tell us about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and what should someone of the classical liberal persuasion take away from that? What value, what examples can we learn from this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe let me begin with making this point to our listeners who are friends of libertarian tradition, that there is this text. I don't know how well known it is, but is in a book edited by Roderick Long and late Thibaut McCann on the debate between anarchism and minarchism. And there is this essay by an author called Adam Reed, and the essay is about Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a pretty much anarcho-capitalist project. Of course, historians of Poland wouldn't agree with the idea that there would be some kind of anachronism to think about Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a libertarian or anarcho-capitalist project. But I think it's worth mentioning that there is this text in this very good book, by the way, so our listeners can go and check. Have quite immediately libertarian perspective on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So that's one thing. Another thing, as you mentioned, I entirely agree with what you said. There is some uniqueness to the project, and the uniqueness is it consists in exactly what you said, which is when you compare the development of political institutions in Poland in, let's say, through Middle Ages and up to the Enlightenment time with what was going on in the Western Europe, then you immediately begin to see the difference around the 15th century. Because the development of monarchy in Western Europe was basically going through three main stages, right? There was patrimonial monarchy at the beginning, and throughout Middle Ages, up to the late Middle Ages, when the 14th century enters the estate monarchy. So a kind of political regime in which noblemen and the clergy acquire pretty strong political position vis-à-vis the king, vis-à-vis the central government. And the entire play between these two forces begins. And the king is trying to minimize the influence of the noblemen by getting into some kind of alliance with either lower level noblemen or with burghers or bourgeoisie, as we would say, and so on. And this ends up with absolute monarchy, as you mentioned, in the Western Europe. In Poland, this process did not take place. So when we had, after the period of patrimonial monarchy, through the Middle Ages, ending in 14th century, in Poland that was the unification of Poland after the feudal fragmentation by our king Władysław Łokietek in 1320. Then the estate monarchy begins, and the nobleman becoming to acquire more and more privileges. So these sort of breakthrough constitutions that we had in Poland, it was 15th century, let's say 1454, that was constitution of Nieszawa, and then so-called nihil novi constitution, which is nothing new, 1505. This nihil novi constitution was basically that the king is not able to do anything without, nothing new, no new laws without the agreement of the noblemen. And then it only went further, till the end of the 16th century. The Polish-Lithuanian real union, Commonwealth, begins in 1569, and the first free election, it's 1573. So then it sort of accelerates at that time, and instead of having absolute monarchy, centralized government, although by today's standard, remember, it's not even close to what we have now, right? About centralized power and control. It was called nonetheless, absolute monarchy. We are having something that is called nobleman's democracy, or nobleman republic, something very different. Very strong role of nobleman vis-à-vis the king, who becomes really not, I would say, losing all real power, right? You also mentioned, which was very interesting in your question, that it's not only sunshine and rainbows, right? That there were some drawbacks to the situation. And this is a very interesting and also controversial question. As you know, to assess what was going on in history and in Poland, I mean, maybe let me take it back a little bit. So the hypothesis would be this: because we had this sort of anarchy or decentralized government of noblemen with a very weak king, it actually led to what happened in the second half of the 18th century, which was partition of Poland, right? The first partition of Poland, 1772. Some people argue that it was because of that we didn't have, how would you say it, in French, raison d'être, which is the sort of central idea of the interest of the state. We didn't have it because we had noblemen and all these magnates, who were so powerful that the king was nothing in comparison, and therefore they had divergent interests. Some of them, at the end of the day, actually turned out to be traitors. They cooperated with the Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, for instance, in this infamous Targowica Confederation, 1792 in Poland, to which, by the way, our king, former lover of the Catherine the Great, Stanisław August Poniatowski, joined. So he is also sometimes considered this sort of one of the traitors, let's say, right? But anyway, so coming back on track, I would say so the hypothesis is that it happened because we didn't have this central power. But I would like to underline the fact that this is just one of hypotheses. So this is up for grabs as far as the discussion is concerned. There were other forces in play, for sure, that also had amazing influence on what happened with Poland, and some of them at international level as well, right? So yeah, there is this discussion, which also shows that you can look at, I suppose, at this part of the Polish history, the Commonwealth, with Lithuania, up to the time of partitions, as some sort of laboratory of freedom, of decentralization, of lack of central power, and what can come out of it, right? What are the dangers? What are the advantages? Yeah, you also mentioned the golden liberty. Yeah, that was something unprecedented. I think it's also worth mentioning what was the part of the golden liberty. The golden liberty wasn't only some sort of tradition; it was also a set of legal documents, bills of rights of different kind. So, for instance, we had this King Henry's articles, so-called Artykuły Henrykowskie, in which a newly freely elected king had to agree on some conditions that the noblemen were setting for him, right? So really limiting his role. We also had this Warsaw Confederation, 1573, which was guaranteeing religious freedom in Poland. So Poland at that time was the land of the free, religion-wise, basically. So that was another thing. We also had some other solutions like Pacta Conventa, again regulating the relationship between the central power that the king was at least nominally wielding and the noblemen who had the real power, right? And yeah, mentioned by you, very controversial idea, a liberum veto. So the idea was basically this, that when you had a Sejm, which is the sort of parliament, right, Polish parliament, lower chamber of parliament today, we would say, and they were deciding the most important things in the country's politics, because again, king didn't have much to say. It was possible for a single MP to say, stop, I disagree. And the entire Sejm collapsed. So it was controversial, of course, although it was actually used quite late in the history, because the first time of using the liberum veto in Poland, that was the middle of the 17th century. But it was used a few times. And some people give it as an example of basically the generation of the idea of liberty. But again, I think it is up for grabs. Some people argue that it wasn't so bad, that actually it was some sort of mechanism that was allowing smart and experienced politicians, experienced noblemen, to single-handedly take care of the interest of whether that would be the Republic, the Commonwealth, or some important parts of it, right? So it was also, some people argue, some historians argue, that it wasn't so bad, right? Yes, maybe I will stop for now here. I guess we would also like to discuss a little bit of Polish constitution of the of the 3rd May.
Yes, I think we can bring that up a little bit. We're inching closer to modern times here.
Oh, it's still close. Okay.
But one thing I do want to mention for the English-speaking audience, so if you're listening to this and you want to look more into the topics, right? Yeah, be aware, like Łukasz mentions, if you start reading this stuff about Poland's decentralization and things like the veto and just the fact that the executive power was so weak, clearly in English. I don't read Polish, so I don't know what other theses are being put out there. But in the information that's available in English, absolutely the dominant thesis is that the reason Poland had so many problems with the Prussians and the Russians in terms of foreign affairs was because they were too decentralized, was because they didn't have enough executive centralized power. And that's just something that keeps coming up again and again. So yes, thank you for mentioning that there are dissenting voices on this, because yeah, that is definitely something that needs to be looked at, I think, in more detail among Americans who are looking into the topic. It's just as if you were reading about the constitutional history of the United States, right? Everyone will tell you the old Articles of Confederation were no good, and everyone recognized you needed something else. And I've just encountered that that's essentially the same sort of consensus, quote unquote, as to, oh, gee, the Poles were too decentralized.
Yeah, if I may jump in here, because maybe one more thing should be mentioned also here to have this context for Poland. And I think that it's very important to realize what's Polish geography. Right? I mean, we cannot escape that. We located where we are, right? And I think it's important to mention that, because it also gives you this context, even for such discussions like, okay, whether our decentralization was an important factor in, leading to partitions. Maybe it was somehow important, maybe it wasn't, but it's important to remember that there were other factors very important, right? What were the other factors? They are sort of more general factors. So geography, that's one, sort of unavoidable, right? Poland is located in a place which connects the western part of Europe with Asia. And in the place, which is this North European plains, literally the only place through which peoples can move from Asia to Western Europe and from Western Europe to Asia. We own this highway. If you would like to get from Asia to Western Europe, you go through Poland. In the north you have Baltic Sea. It's difficult to cross, much more difficult than on land, right? In the south you have Carpathian Mountains, also difficult to cross. So you take Poland as your highway. I wouldn't like to sound deterministic or geographically deterministic, but this fact cannot be ignored, right? So we were always located, as people say, between Russia and Prussia, or Russia and Germany, and so on. well, yeah, political powers that they have their political interest. They want to play an important role in the part of the world, and to do it quite often, involves basically, using the geographical resources to achieve these goals, and it's very dangerous then, be located in this sort of place. Although that might also be an opportunity. That's also important to remember. And so I just wanted to mention that. That's also important because when you think about Poland as some sort of laboratory of freedom, you should also take that into consideration. It's a different story to have decentralization in a land that never been invaded, right? Seriously, and in a land which is all the time, this is a highway of peoples from the dawn of time, right? I think that's an interesting question, because then you somehow have to balance maybe important ideals and interesting organizational settings like decentralization with brute reality of political power and military power, right? You somehow have to wrap your hand around that, which is pretty difficult, I think.
Well, really, if Poland can make a go of it as long as they did, with that much decentralization being located between the Prussians and the Russians, you have no excuse if you're an island nation, if you're Spain, if you're in North America or South America. What's your excuse for all of your centralization? You clearly don't need it for geopolitical reasons, because you don't have nearly the geographical disadvantages that the Poles have. That's something that should probably be considered. The fact that they had that much decentralization at all is really quite remarkable, and that it worked as well as it did for as long as it did. But people will say, oh, well, the 16th century, that's just a long time ago. So let's just bring it up then to what we would think of as modern liberalism. That is post-American Revolution sort of liberalism, right? Jefferson sort of stuff. And in that, we can just look to the 1790s, right? We have, of course, the Americans secede. They talk about self-determination. We don't have to be governed by outsiders. We can have our own state. And also there's this constitutional tradition that becomes popular thanks in large part to the Americans. And also there was a connection between some Polish noblemen and the American revolutionaries. And so I could name two. One of the notable generals that we had on our side in America was Pulaski, who have lots of stuff still named after him to this day. And then there was Tadeusz Kościuszko, please pardon my American accent, however that is properly said, who also worked under Washington in America, was very familiar with the Declaration of Independence and all that sort of stuff. Goes back to Poland and is instrumental in the liberal movement there. And so the Poles then, they have what's called the May 3rd Constitution. This is in 1791. So this is all in the wake of the American Revolution. And they attempt to create their own constitution, similar, not necessarily modeled on the U.S. because the realities are so different, but it's in that tradition. It doesn't last very long because of meddling from the Poles and the Austrian, or meddling from the Russians and the Austrians and the Germans. But it seems to me, looking from the outside, that this reflects a larger tradition that's in place there, that there's already an existing tradition that comes up to the 20th century in terms of legislative government, in terms of this idea of constitutions limiting the power of the state, that this is something that would have seemed very alien to, say, a Spanish absolutist, but which seemed natural to the Poles, as far as I can see. So am I interpreting that correct? Is there in the late 18th century a burgeoning real liberal tradition that never really quite goes away, even 200 years later? Or is that just something I'm just imagining and kind of substituting my hopes and dreams for reality?
Yeah, that's another interesting question, I would say. You were absolutely spot on with Polish heroes also helping American War of Independence, like Kazimierz Puławski and Tadeusz Kościuszko. With the Constitution 1791, I think there is some room for discussion. I wouldn't like to denigrate that. There is a lot to what you said. But I would like to use this opportunity, maybe say something a bit controversial. And I would like to draw your attention to some facts about this constitution. First of all, my take on libertarianism, especially as far as politics is concerned, let's say the socio-political aspect of libertarianism, is pretty much conservative in European understanding of this word, and therefore I would be willing to point out that, of course, it is praised as the second constitution in the world, right after 1787 American Constitution. Well, I mean, what it is really, it's a written document, written constitution. But we had constitution before, which was basically not written. It was the way of our life. And what was the way of life of Poles before this written piece of paper? It was, as we mentioned, love of freedom, love of decentralization, of independence, also these ideals and religion and so on and so forth. And now comes the Constitution, which is a written document, sort of replacing, in this sense, the natural way of existence of Polish nation, which had its integral natural constitution, which was basically not written, but it was there, with a set of ideas that come from Enlightenment, like separation of powers. But mainly, I mean, also it's important to remember that the Constitution, one of the aspects or results of the Constitution, or ambitions of the Constitution, is to strengthen the role of lower noblemen and burghers. So it sort of set in motion this trend, which not entirely, because the position of the Polish king under the Constitution was actually held weak or weakened, but to set in motion pretty similar, let's say, trends that were governing centralization of power in the Western Europe, right? Basically lowering and weakening the position of the noblemen, especially of the higher status noblemen. So these are, we have already two things that might be and should be mentioned, just to sort of hold our horses about this enthusiasm that we have something amazing before our eyes. Well, we have something that is for sure, time-wise, maybe precedented only by the American Constitution. Some people say that there was a Swedish Constitution that was second, Polish was third. I mean, and then the whole list, the whole bargaining, who was first, who was second, as if it really mattered so much.
Well, let me be clear also, I'm not a big fan of the 1788 Constitution. I prefer the 1776
So you know what I mean, right?
Yes.
You know what I mean, yeah.
Right.
So we on the same page, I think, right? So
yeah, I prefer the less revolutionary, less centralizing Constitution from the 70s, not the one they came up with in the late 80s, which was this more centralist counter-revolution. So, yeah, just because it's a written constitution doesn't mean it's great, especially if it's going against already existing decentralizing institutions.
Yeah,
so, yes,
that might actually
issue.
be bad. This fact might actually be bad, right? And from the conservative point of view, which I recommend people to consider at least, right? It's actually considered bad, right? Because it runs against the natural sort of way of living people have. Yeah, so. And it was short-lived, as you mentioned. So the importance of that for the history, later history and generally speaking history of Poland might be a little bit exaggerated, I would say.
Well, I would say, though, that there's no part of the reason I think that people are inclined to believe that Poland had a good sense of these Western institutions that are good for economic growth, generally good standard of living, the sorts of things that we consider good in the modern world, that at least since they managed to break free of Soviet domination, that Poland has been one of the more successful post-Soviet states. I mean, it was a de facto part of the Soviet Union in terms of you try and do anything your own way, the tanks roll in. I mean, we saw what happened in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on. Obviously not formally part, like the way the Baltics were. Nevertheless, they couldn't just do whatever they wanted, and they couldn't just ally themselves with the Western economies, right? But, however, they seem to have positioned themselves quite well since the 90s. And then there was that period, of course, of real independence between the world wars and all of that. And it just seemed, at a certain level, natural for this country. Whereas some countries, when they become independent, when they become free, they're like, what are these Western institutions? We don't understand legislative government. We need a military strongman to run this government, right? Poland's never seemed to have that inclination. And so we look now and we see, okay, what economies have done well since 1989? And Poland's one of the ones that has done better. In terms of GDP per capita, it's not that high. It's still a middle-income country, but they started from much, much lower, and in just 30 years have come up significantly. And in American we would say, well, they took to like Western economic growth like a duck to water, is kind of the old saying, you might say. So is that due somewhat to some of these existing institutions where there's this idea of there was warm feelings toward integration toward the West, and that the country was already comfortable with ideas of legislative government and the rule of law and those sorts of things that we attribute a lot of successful Western economic growth to today?
So let me maybe start with the comment again. With this story, so what happened after 1989 in Poland, as with previous stories, there is room for interpretation, right? And there are good things and there are some downsides, as you mentioned yourself earlier, right? But this time I would like to mention only good sides. Because I think I agree, many good things happened since that time. It's important to have the proper perspective in mind. So we have the third partition of Poland, 1795. This Polish political way of living, let's call it, a country or a state, ceases to exist. Then Poland acquires independence 1918. 1918, only for more or less 20 years. The Second World War starts, and as you mentioned, then we are under the shoe of communists and the Soviet Union and the international communism and all these bad things. We are literally isolated from what's going on in the world, and when I think about it from my personal point of view, for instance, we are pretty much isolated from what's going on in the Western science, in the academia, culture, trade, economy, written in large, and so on. So we are in a very tough position. And yet, as you mentioned as well, since 1989, we managed to become one of the leading societies and economies in the Central and Eastern Europe, which is amazing. Frankly speaking, I think might have been better. As I mentioned, there are some downsides. We know from history cases of countries that were able to, came from feudalism to modern industrial countries in 50 years, 100 years, right? Pretty quickly. I don't think we have this level of growth and development, but our level is pretty decent. I would like to, for sure, congratulate my compatriots. That's a good job, I think. And another thing is, why it happened? Why it happened? You asked. We had some institutions in place. Institution that was really important for the fall of communism in Poland. It was, of course, the same institution with which we started our discussion today, which was Catholic Church. A very strong position of Catholic Church provided counterbalance profound counterbalance to communists, basically, right? So people had this sort of communitarian support in Catholic Church. Remember, we also got the Pope, right? Which was an amazing boost for Polish spirits. So that was also important. And yeah, liberal tradition, as you called it, even if people didn't call it this way, this sort of love of individual initiative and freedom, suspicion towards any central, especially strong form of government. I mean, it clearly played an important role in coming to where we are now, and I think we are in a pretty good position. Maybe abstracting from some hard data. Everybody can go on the internet and check it, right? GDP you can check, bad as it is, it still tells us something. But you can check GDP, you can check unemployment, inflation, you can check this data. But from the point of view of a person who lives in Poland every day and who travels the world, I can tell that many things we achieved that are exceptionally good. Right, we have already pretty good infrastructure, which was a relatively short period of time. Main roads, although some libertarians would say, probably not without reason, that roads might be a bad thing. But, whatever, I mean, we have them, they're pretty good. Okay, I'll give you one example, just, personal story sort of. First time I came to the US, it was 2003. And I came there then as a student for an exchange. The program was called Work and Travel. So we were coming to the US for the summer, working in an amusement park. I was actually working in an amusement park as a student. That was Hershey Park in Pennsylvania, Chocolate City. And, working 3 months, then we were supposed to travel around the US. My impression then when I came in 2003, it was like coming to the heaven on earth. Literally. What was going on in Poland and what was going on in the US, economy-wise, goods in shops, infrastructure, everything was better, right? From my point of view back then as a young student. With all due respect, when I come now, it's not anymore, right? So there are many things that we, I think, we have already the same or better level, like infrastructure, especially, major cities, services, restaurants, architecture, roads, the internet, electricity, wires, things like that. Because, of course, I know why as well, right? Because you have all the infrastructure, you wouldn't like to consume it or throw it away and now build a new one. That's, of course, you wait until it, stops working, then you will replace it. But it is what it is. We have it, done pretty well now, and it's impressive. So life in Poland is becoming pleasant, regardless of some shifts in current politics, which are, upsides, downsides and so on. But generally, the trend is good, in my opinion. And it's a nice place to live in.
Well, let's talk about some of those trends. I think this is the longest I've gone without speaking on Radio Rothbard, because as a product of the American public school system, I'm out of my depth immediately when we start talking about dealing with a historical timeline, as we already have so far this episode. But you mentioned earlier about how, under communist rule, the capture of academia, of the culture. And one of the things that we've seen at the Institute is that a lot of the former Soviet nations have been a tremendous well of talent for interest in Austrian economics. And I know within Poland right now, it is one of the strongest networks out there when it comes to scholars, when it comes to universities. I know there's, in fact, a Dominiak tree of scholars out there getting their PhDs now. And so for our listeners, can you talk a little bit about this tradition and how the works of Mises, the works of Rothbard, interest in Austrian economics, how that stands within the Polish intellectual climate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I agree entirely. We have very interesting trend of growing libertarian scholarship in Poland. Clearly, I mean, Austrian economics. I think this is something we've witnessed already for some time. We have Polish Mises Institute. You probably remember this sort of older generation. They're not older because, age-wise, they're pretty young people, but older in a sense that they were coming here to the institute a bit earlier, right? So you for sure are aware of, our great scholars like Matt Mackay, like Jakub Bożydar, Wiśniewski, all these, Austrian economists from Poland that, were coming here, then they were establishing Polish Mises Institute and so on. So that's one part of the story. But I would like to use this opportunity to talk about the other part of the story. And the other part of the story is that besides Austrian economics, we also have growing libertarian scholarship, as you mentioned, in Poland. And maybe let me begin, although I suppose we're getting close to the end of the discussion, but still this thread, I will begin with the comment that I think, because the question might be asked, what happened in Poland that we have now such a growing trend in libertarian scholarship, as we do? I would say that libertarianism with a prominent role of Rothbardianism is this sort of philosophy that for some reason, probably because of its logical coherence, logical consistency, its sort of austere beauty of rationality, attracts people who are naturally very intelligent. And then all people I know in libertarian scholarship in Poland are extremely intelligent people. So first of all, I think libertarianism has this potential to attract these very intelligent people, and they are attracted in the academia and social environment, which is very free for thinking. So we don't have all these problems that you are now struggling with in American academia. You know what I mean, right? So we have relatively huge space of freedom. And therefore, even at the best universities and our best institutions of science, there is a room for libertarian scholarship. So all these naturally very intelligent people, they, making their careers pretty quickly, and they're growing. They're growing in academia. So what it means? So not only we have PhD students, we now already in this generation have people who are getting employed, getting tenure, whose research is almost exclusively libertarian, working on Rothbardian libertarianism. I'm not talking about Nozick. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about, like real libertarians. Hotbed. I mean, see?
The good stuff.
Yeah, the good stuff. The sexy stuff. Hotbed, Rothbard, right? So we have people getting positions at the best universities, working on that. Getting grants from, Polish Science Center, for instance. And I think these people should be mentioned, these scholars. So we have this younger generation, let me mention some of them because they're amazing scholars. I recommend that, our listeners go and read their papers, go and read their books. We have Norbert Slenzok, who works on Hoppe and pushing forward Hoppean scholarship, especially argumentation ethics, but also Hoppe's theory of monarchy. I learned a lot from this person, right? Another friend, another colleague is Stanisław Wójtowicz, who runs his own blog on libertarianism. So he has this libertarian encyclopedia in his blog, explaining many things from the libertarian point of view. It's a very popular thing. When we have our gatherings like summer school in libertarian political philosophy, for instance, organized by the Mises Institute, and we gather 100 people, youngsters, or maybe not 100 exactly, but it was 80 or something close. Some of them, they aware of these things, right? They learn about libertarianism from this activity, like from Stanisław's blog, for instance, right? So yeah, I also have my, Stanisław is actually part of my team, of my research team, but I also have Igor Wysocki, people who publish already very high in international journals, which is, as you know, not so easy because of also the, let's say, political correctness aspect of academia in the Western world. But we are able to acquire these good publications because the quality of the scholarship, I think, is growing, and these young people are tremendous, So, yeah, at the moment, I can say I am very happy to have 3 PhDs under me, all of them writing on libertarianism. Already promoted one PhD who got employed in economics department in Nicolaus Copernicus University, David Meger, who's, from what I learned, correct me if I'm wrong, is going to be summer fellow this year here in the Mises Institute. Incredible scholar, very intelligent. Yeah, so what else? Maybe I can also say that we have because we have different setting in academia and different history than you have here of scholarship, also of libertarian scholarship. Everything seems closer here. I mean, like, Rothbard was right here. We see things from a little bit more distance. So for you, Rothbard was, that was a friend of Joe Salerno, a friend of Walter Block. These people were here, just, in flesh, right? For us, Rothbard is like Kant, is like Aristotle. It's a philosopher that we know from books only, right? So we have, and that gives us a different perspective. Probably part of this perspective, of the difference in this perspective, is also that we are more willing to venture some new interpretations, and therefore we employ quite often all the achievements of the contemporary philosophy, of analytic philosophy especially, right? Trying to look slightly different in things, and also to search for different routes. They might be a little bit more unorthodox, but I think they really push things forward as far as libertarian scholarship is concerned. And I would venture the prediction that something new is coming from that, and I think that, something of a stature of Polish libertarian school might be on the horizon. So brace yourself for that.
And I think these conversations are fascinating because, being at events like this, and we've got such an interesting mix of people. We've got younger students, we have donors, we have scholars. Inescapable is, particularly you mentioned kind of how America is no longer heaven on earth. There is a, I think there's people yearning for what can be that city on the hill, and often the focus is politics, and so there's a lot of excitement for Argentina and Milei. We saw it a few years ago with trends in Brazil and less Marx, more Mises protests and the like. But what I find fascinating is this dynamic where you are creating within Poland, how there's an intellectual climate with building kind of the stage of production in terms of ultimately the end goal of these ideas manifesting itself in action. That there's a good argument to be made that Poland's intellectual climate is a very unique one globally, and one that libertarians, including those in the U.S., should be paying attention to, as you mentioned. I mean, I know we've got to get out of here, which is always a great time spending time with you, Łukasz. Before we get out of here, since we are at AERC, what's the research that has brought you here to the conference?
Yeah, which is part of the previous question, I suppose, right? Because you can immediately see how fruitful is the scholarship in Poland, right? I have this opportunity to present 3 papers during this conference here, in cooperation with our colleagues from the Mises Institute, from the US and from France and Germany. So 3 topics. One topic is connected with the question of the status of public domain. I mean, how we can understand what's the juridical or moral status of public domain in the statist setting, right? Because of course we know in the free society there would be no such a thing as state-claimed public domain. So the question is, what's the status of the public domain? How we can approach this question, especially taking into consideration the fact that we have different kinds of public domain, and how it then gives us some information or some suggestions about some important current issues. And one of such issues is, of course, COVID-19 policies, how they should be assessed from the libertarian point of view. We already have some interesting debate in our learned journals, like Journal of Libertarian Studies. Norbert Slenzok, mentioned earlier, contributed to that debate, and of course, one and only Walter Block. And we would like to add our grain to that. So that's one project, right? But I think it's what we have to say might be interesting for many people. Another project that we are working on, this is more into Austrian economics, cooperation with Mises Institute scholar Jonathan Newman, great colleague and friend, an amazing scholar on time preference. The funny thing about time preference is that it takes time. So it started, it all started in 2015. This amazing cohort of 2015 of fellows. The entire summer we spent here, we discussed time preference with Jonathan. And then, we went our own ways. 9 years passed, and now we're back to the topic with finally some solutions, I think. So that's another project. And the third one is the project by myself, and it's at the hard core of what we're doing with libertarianism in Poland, exploring the borders of first principles via some analytic tools of the contemporary philosophy. I will be talking about the principle of voluntariness as a possible window into many aspects of libertarianism. If we really try to think in depth about voluntariness, we might learn something about such things as permissibility or legality of blackmail, unjust enrichment, disgorgement of proceeds of crime, enlarging the set of first libertarian principles of justice, and the borders of homesteading. So pretty fundamental things as far as libertarian theory is concerned. And I hope there will be vivid discussion about that. And so here you have it.
That's why I always enjoy AERC is always one of my favorite events all year, and being able to interact with our great scholars. The tree of Austrian scholarship, of libertarian scholarship, is growing quite nicely. And I think we'll leave it on that note. For Ryan, for Dr. Dominiak, this is Tho Bishop. Thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next week.